I guess the assignment has been given to me to talk a little bit about contextualization. And I have to admit, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is to be with other ministry leaders and pastors. I've been teaching at the seminary for about 14 years now, and kind of my passion has died over the years. But I have a great increased passion to spend time with pastors, fellow brothers who are laboring to care for people, sometimes very difficult people, and dealing with complex issues in the local church, and helping people to understand what it means to move out with a deep, rich theological vision that is rooted in the gospel that we find in Scripture. And so it's a great delight. I always learn wonderful things and have great experiences when I spend time with fellow pastors. So thank you for allowing me to be here. What I thought I'd do this first session is to talk a little bit about my own context, because my context is going to be very different than yours. Rather than saying that this is my context and therefore this is what you ought to do, right? I mean, that's not a good way to move forward anyways. We always have to be careful that we don't say, well, this is the new model and this is what you need to do in your context. Well, no, not necessarily, because your context is very different than mine. That is why we talk about a contextualized ministry, because Allen Park is different than Boston, right? And Boston is different than Detroit. And so we need to understand that. So some of you might be aware that I pastor a church in Center City, Boston. So it is a city church. You have to understand that when we think about urban ministry, it's not just about doing ministry in inner city parts of the city, but we have to understand that there are many different neighborhoods and different dynamics involved in city ministry. And so I'm right there in the center city part of Boston, and I've been there for about 13 years. And our church is a typical city church where you have racial diversity and a lot of young people and hypermobility and idolatry. It's pretty much what you would expect. And so what I wanted to do was, and I realized that many of you are not doing ministry in a context that's focused on an urban center, so I don't want you to think that this is city propaganda and I'm trying to convince you that cities really matter. Well, they actually do matter. This is not to say that non-urban areas do not matter. This is not to say that ex-urban communities are unimportant. I'm not saying that cities matter more, right? As some people have criticized me of thinking that I'm saying, and that's not what I'm saying at all. I mean, we have to have churches wherever there are people, but there are a lot of people in cities. And so if I always tell my friends who are doing ministries in rural areas or ex-urban communities, I tell them, well, don't you want to plant churches and bring the gospel wherever people are? Oh, absolutely. Well, then you should support this vision of planting as many churches as possible in urban centers, because that's where the people are going. So I'm going to give you that context, so bear with me and be patient. I'm not suggesting that this is your context, but I would say even if you are part of what Doug Saunders calls an arrival community, right, or an arrival city, or an ex-urban community. I don't like the word suburban, right, because it sounds a little pejorative. It's just not urban, but all of the ex-urban communities are influenced, whether we know it or we recognize it, from what happens in the city. It doesn't happen in the reverse. And so let me tell you a few things about the importance of cities, and then we'll get into some contextual issues. The first is the importance of cities. Nearly 5.5 million people move into cities every month. That is the size of a San Francisco Bay Area being created every month. 22% of the world's population lives in 600 cities. And these 600 cities generate 60% of the world's GDP. Or to put it another way, there are 35 mega regions in the world. And this area will be part of the whole Chicago, Detroit, this a mega region. And the 35 mega regions in the world represent 66% of the world's economic output. There are currently 23 megacities with over 10 million in population, and by 2025 there will be 36. China's urban population will grow 350 million people, its urban population, within the next 25 years. I mean, granted that the government can control those things and they pretty much send people wherever they want to send people, but this is a phenomenon that we find in the world through globalization and urbanization. We know that at the year 1800, less than 2% of the world's population lived in urban centers. 1900, about 11%. And today, it's about 53%. And by 2050, it will be around 70%. The world is becoming more urban. So you might be familiar with Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, and he believed because of globalization, we'll be able to telecommunicate with people wherever we want to be, so you can be fly fishing somewhere in Montana and hanging out at some coffee shop in Seattle and communicate with people around the globe. That's true. But his assumption that that is built on that reality, that people won't necessarily want to migrate into cities, is false. The data doesn't support that. The world is really spiky. It's not flat at all. And think about it. When you have all the land mass in the state of New York, why would everyone want to be in that little space there, geographic space in Manhattan? I mean, why is that? Why would people want to be in a highly densely populated area? Now, some of you who might not like being in a highly densely populated area might be asking that question. But again, because of the forces of urbanization and globalization, that we are finding more people are moving into cities. And cities have been very, very influential. So we've seen different stages of the waves of urbanization. It started with the first wave of the imperial city, Babylon, Alexandria, Rome. The second wave of commercial cities during the medieval period, Paris, Venice, Milan. And the third wave of industrial cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, like Detroit and London and St. Petersburg and Pittsburgh. And of course, the fourth and the greatest wave, what we call mega global cities, or what Saskia Sassen calls global cities. And we no longer can think of urban centers as a metropolis, but we have to think of it as a mega region, as a megalopolis or a megapolis. And therefore, even though you say, well, Detroit's only about 20 miles away, well, you are part of that whole mega region. And what happens there and what happens in other cities will ultimately influence all of the neighboring communities. So let me say a few things about the three ingredients of what makes a city a city. Cities are centers of power. In the United States, more than 90% of all economic output is produced in metropolitan regions, while just the 5 largest metro regions account for about a quarter of it. And so if cities are centers of culture, then that center will provide power, safety, governance, economic opportunity. And this is the reason why I believe that many people are being drawn, again, not necessarily to center city, but drawn to urban areas or a mega region. Secondly, cities are centers of culture, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. Now, again, I am not creating a false dichotomy between the city and suburbs. There's certainly an interplay and a mutual dependence. But not only do the suburbs receive culture shaped by the city, they receive people shaped by the city. And the other thing is that cities are centers of ideas. And this is, I believe, to put it in this perspective, about 100 years ago, you had 2 primary sectors for economic output. You had the service sector and you had manufacturing. But now today, we have manufacturing, service, each one representing about a third of our economic output. And then the third sector is the creative class. It is the creative sector. Not just a bunch of artists and musicians, they don't make a whole lot of money, but we're talking about entrepreneurs, we're talking about engineers, we're talking about research scientists. These are the people who are innovating. They're the ones who are creating. And so if you have an industrial city that was primarily built on manufacturing, and the economy has put that city in a certain situation where they're not able to develop, then what needs to happen? That they need to reshape their understanding of how to develop the city, and they need to innovate. So that's what's going on in the process at this moment with Detroit and Buffalo. I'm not so sure if Buffalo is making a whole lot of progress, but Cleveland is trying to do that, and there are certain cities like that. And of course, other cities are already very creative. They have a high creative index, like San Francisco, Boston, and Washington, D.C., and you see these things happening. And thirdly, cities are centers of worship. They're centers of worship. Now, I am not saying that the urban dwellers or city dwellers are worshiping God. Of course, that we know that that's not happening in cities. There's a very low percentage. In our city, it's less than 2% of the city's population attends churches. Right? I mean, London, for example, you know that there are more Muslims than there are Christians who attend churches, even though the Anglican Church is the official religion. So what we need to understand is that every community has a liturgy. There's always a liturgy, and it is our responsibility to determine what that liturgy is. So if I were to ask you, what is the one word that would define, I know this is overly simplistic, and we have to be careful that we're not too reductionistic, but nevertheless, what would be that one word, idea that might describe your community, even if you're not from a city? What would that be? That represents the prevailing cultural storyline of your community. For my city, it would be knowledge. Knowledge is our God. Knowledge is our idol. And so the urban liturgies of Boston will clearly highlight that, right? I mean, it's not coincidental that people will quote scholars from institutions around Boston. Boston is an academic hub of the entire world, I can argue, because there are a little less than 300,000 university students within a 15-mile radius. There are 55 colleges and universities within a 15-mile radius around Boston. Boston is the only city that has more top elite selective colleges than any other city. No other city comes even close, not even Chicago and San Francisco or New York. And so knowledge is our God. And so if you fail to understand the urban liturgies, right, people's way of expressing their worship, because I tell people, look, it's not as though only religious people and Christians worship. Everyone is a worshiper. The question is, what do we worship? I might worship the living God of the Bible and history, but you have your urban liturgies, you worship your God, which is education and knowledge. And so it's very easy to find the point of reference when I want to talk about that issue. I have no problems talking about worship to the city dwellers in Boston, because they understand it. Right? They value things. They recognize some things to be worthy to receive their affection. And so I believe that when you are in a very cosmopolitan place, there is a cosmopolitan spirit that is open to new ideas. This is the reason why I think that people can be converted in cities. You know, we tend to think all the evil, all the terrible things, all the crime, and all the poverty that's found in cities. Yeah, certainly we have those things, but let's be fair. It's not as though that cities are the only places where this happens. The last time I checked, all the really crazy things happen outside of cities, you know. I feel very safe in cities. I feel safe in a city. I go around, there are a lot of people late at night, you know, but if I were to walk around in some remote place with no lights and no people, then I get a little scared. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you are in an urban center, you need to be very aware. Just as Paul went into cities and he was aware. He was He wanted to understand what the prevailing storyline was of that particular community so that he would be able to speak into it. And we have to be careful. I understand that we all believe in the rich theology of the gospel, which is so thick and so rich and so robust, and that we don't have a thin understanding of who Jesus is and what God has done in history, and that's what makes our kind of theological tradition so beautiful, and this is the reason why we are here, and that's great, and we need to maintain that, and we need to guard it, even with the forces of secularism in our world. However, the tendency that I find within our own kind of theological camp is that we don't want to engage culture with a robust, contextualized approach because we're afraid that we're going to, what? We're going to compromise on our theological convictions. Well, you shouldn't be afraid of that. I mean, if you really do believe in what you believe, then you won't compromise that at all. As long as you have the Word of God, you understand a biblical understanding of what Jesus has done, what the gospel is, and that becomes central to everything that you do, then you'll be able to look at all the other peripheral issues. You'll be able to look at culture. You'll be able to look at social justice, yes. You'll be able to look at how to help the poor. You'll be able to look at politics from the lens of this rich theological worldview. And so do not be afraid. Do not think that, once you start thinking about contextualization, what it means to engage the culture, that you're going to abandon your theological vision, because you see a lot of these younger guys who are trying to be hip and relevant, and so they have the same vision, and next thing you know, they're just talking about human trafficking and sex trafficking, and they think that's the gospel. Well, obviously that you're going to find some people who do that, and that's not because they had a thick, rich theological vision when they first started. They never had it from the beginning. So they had no theological center that was shaping the way they looked at everything. But we do, and so do not be afraid to engage the culture. I would imagine for many people, even in my own church, who don't have a robust view of contextualization, well, they will look at their relationship to culture in one particular way. That is through evangelism. That is a terrible, I mean, evangelism is great. That could have been taken out of context. Don't tweet that. But evangelism is absolutely necessary because there's no worship everywhere, right? So we need to evangelize, absolutely. We need to be missional. But you cannot think that the only way that you can relate to your culture is through evangelism. That's not the only way that we relate to culture. That's absolutely important and necessary. People don't know Christ, so we need to proclaim the gospel. I am not diminishing the centrality of the proclamation of the gospel. This is what we do. We preach expositorily, yes, in the city of Boston. If you're to come to our church, our services are far more liturgical than most worship services in ex-urban communities. It's very liturgical. I'm Presbyterian. But we need to know that we need to seek the shalom of our communities. We need to be concerned about, yes, I'll use this word, human flourishing for the glory of God. Yes, we need to pursue the common good. Yes, that's not a bad thing to understand it that way. Again, if that's all we're doing, and we're saying that's the gospel, there are major problems. But that's not what I'm saying. And so we need to understand the different characteristics and to understand the prevailing storyline of our communities. I also want to talk about the characteristics of cities. In my city in particular. Cities are magnets. Secondly, cities are amplifiers. And thirdly, the city is an engine. The first is the city as a magnet. The city attracts three different types of people. Number one, it attracts aspirational people. Number two, marginalized people. And thirdly, explorational people. Aspirational people. I mentioned this last night during the sermon, and most of the people in urban areas are future-oriented, and their aspirations are imaginative. In other words, the reason why they're aspiring is because they sense as though they're not quite there yet, right? And of course, this is a dynamic that happens in people who are in their 20s, in their 30s and 40s. I would say even in their 50s. Of course, once you reach 60s and 70s, you realize, okay, my time is up, and it's really hopeless to be aspirational at that point. But not because they've achieved what they've wanted to achieve, but they just have to settle. I mean, the time is up. What can you do? But people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, like my city, the median age is 28. The median age in my church is 27. 70% of my church is single. Yeah, yes, you can have pity on me because we're very hypermobile. I was telling some of the pastors yesterday that within the last, I think, 13 years, if I were to count every single individual who had been at our church for at least 12 months and who are no longer with us, that would be over 2,000 people. So people come and they go. And that's what a city is. And it's a little frustrating. You wish that more people will settle down. And I love hearing stories of people who've been at this church in Bethesda for 15 years. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, that's an eternity in Boston. But aspirational people come. Why do you think that they are always afraid and they're always anxious and insecure? It's because people are coming up to them and saying, oh boy, you have so much potential. And people are like, oh wow, I feel good. They think I've got a lot of potential. And I remind them, well, no, that just simply means that they're saying that you don't have any actual. It means you haven't done anything in life, but you have a whole lot of potential. I mean, as far as I know, you might be an utter failure, but it seems to me that you have potential. That's what aspirational people are. They come and they aspire, they grab, they pursue, they try to achieve. And of course, they're going to be anxious. So you will have, let's say, somebody who comes from a regional high school in an ex-urban community, gets accepted into an elite conservatory in the city of Boston, and they were first violin at their youth orchestra, and they're coming with all sorts of expectations, and they bring their violin, they take the subway, and they're on their way to New England Conservatory or Juilliard, and they realize, wow, the guy who's playing here and asking for some money playing violin over here is better than I am. This is what a city does. So they're aspirational people. Secondly, there are marginalized people. People say, oh, cities create poverty. No, they don't. They attract poor people because there are systems set in place that are, granted that there are all sorts of systemic problems in our cities. I'm not trying to minimize that. Right? There are systemic problems. But they have better structures for accommodating the poor than ex-urban communities, generally speaking. And so, again, when you see aspirational people, when you see marginalized people, when you see explorational people, you need to see the point of contact where there can be an entry point for the gospel. So you see a bunch of aspirational people, you see a bunch of future-oriented, imaginative people, you see people who are overly anxious. Well, that's a powerful setting for the gospel to make its entry into that person's life. Or somebody who has been marginalized all her life, and she comes into your community, and she's struggling with the issue of acceptance. She wants to be approved, she wants to be validated, and she can't calibrate her worth because everyone has rejected her all her life. Well, there's an entry point for the gospel. And so this is kind of what I'm looking to do in my context. Secondly, the city is an amplifier. I'll just kind of skip over that. And the city is an engine where there's fuel for creativity, competition, and culmination. And the important thing here is that the city is a gospel gateway into a center or a community where there are urban liturgies. And that's what we're trying to do. So the second thing I want to do here is to talk about a contextualized ministry vision addressing the storyline of your community. First of all, we need to seek the welfare of our city, the shalom. And of course, there are dual dangers that compromise faithful contextualization. We tend to think that there are only two ways to relate to our culture. One is over-contextualizing, right? So we can demonize all our interlocutors right here, right? The ones who over-contextualize those people who have abandoned the faith, and the ones who are calling the gospel something when that is not the gospel, and they are assimilating for the sake of being relevant. And so that is one danger. But the other danger is being evasive and being separatistic and under-adapting. That's another danger. And I would imagine, generally speaking, that for our theological camp, that's probably the greater danger for us. Right? We're not going out there and calling the gospel what it's not. Okay? We're not in danger of doing that. Right? We're not saying, oh, let's go there and to help the poor, as important as helping the poor is. Okay? And we'll get to that in a moment. And saying, well, that's the gospel. Well, no, that's not the gospel. The gospel can only be proclaimed, right? I mean, we live out the gospel, but doing that might be the result of the gospel, but that's not the gospel itself. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I think the danger for us in our theological camp is for us to under-adapt. And so we just simply say, well, we're going to just preach the gospel. We're not going to be too concerned about contextualizing our message and understanding and finding a point of reference with our world and not giving in to the idols. And we believe that that's all we need to do. Well, there's a lot more. That's important and it's essential. Okay? You see how I'm overqualifying and I'm always, because I know that I hear voices even as I say that, be like, hey, you're saying that gospel proclamation. No, I never said that. Gospel proclamation is essential. I preach about the average time that I spend in preaching a sermon on a given Sunday is about 40 minutes. I don't preach 20 minutes. I can't preach a 20-minute sermon in the city of Boston because it takes me about 15 minutes just to find a point of reference. So I think that is our danger of privatizing our worldview. That's the danger for our folks. So that they think about their Christian lives when they're here at church, but then they privatize it, and there is no effect, there is no strength in their missional witness out in the world. So let me ask you, if I were to tell you, here's an ideological spectrum, and over here on my right would be those who are law-abiding, kind of legalistic, moralistic, people who tend to be a little more rigid. And then over here on the other ideological spectrum will be those people who are liberal and licentious and antinomian, right? Where would you put yourself on this ideological spectrum? Now, let's be honest, right? I don't know. I mean, I know a few of you, but even those of you I don't know very well, but where would you put yourself? Do you tend to have kind of a little more rigid, legalistic tendencies in your heart, or are you the one that tends to be a little more accommodating, right? So in that ideological spectrum, we can say, oh yeah, those guys who have a tendency over here will place a whole lot of emphasis on progressive sanctification and how we need to just have courage and just speak into controversial issues. And then you'll have some others, and people might put me in that camp. We tend to lean a little bit this way where we emphasize, the finished work of Jesus and justification and how we are free in the gospel and we have Christian liberties and so on. So where would you put yourself on this ideological spectrum? I would imagine, if we're not being honest with ourselves, we probably would say, I got a pretty good, nice biblical balance. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I might lean just a little bit to the right or just a little bit to the left. And I would say, well, I think we really need to assess our hearts better than that. I would say that there is no biblical balance in the middle. I would say the gospel is not even on the ideological spectrum. Because it's not as though the gospel comes and gives us some sort of nice middle balanced place. It's the gospel that saves us from legalism. It's the same gospel that saves us from licentiousness. And of course, we would know, of course, the gospel saves those licentious people. You know, they need to be saved. Well, you know what? The gospel also saves those people who are trying to keep the law too. Absolutely, the gospel saves those people who are breaking the law. But the gospel also saves those people who are trying to keep the law and making that their own expression of receiving favor from God. So we take our obedience and we use it as a commodity to barter with God. That's self-salvation. We can't take obedience and bargain with God and say, well, you know, I've done some of this. I've been faithful, God, so you kind of owe me, and this is what you need to do. And you know, I deserve a more flourishing ministry than the one that I'm involved in now. No. God, we don't deserve anything better. Again, if we were to get what we deserve, it would be death and judgment, right? So anything that he gives us is all by his gracious hand. Right? Habakkuk chapter 3. We've got to read that over and over again and make sure that that's impressed deeply into our hearts. We need to be like the psalmist in Psalm 86, who says that my God is a God who is abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, right? That very special Hebrew word combination. That he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, and that he is gracious to me, and he is so ready, here's the promise, to help and to comfort. That's what the psalmist says. And so when we look at the ideological spectrum, we need to know that the gospel is something that's foreign. It is outside of us, right? It's extra nos. It's outside of us. And it's something that needs to come into us through the incarnation, through the atoning work of Jesus, and explode the beautiful mutual interior love, affection that we find in the Godhead that comes and explodes in our hearts, and giving us the power resources, the kingdom emotional capital to be able to know what it means to build a community because of that. Otherwise, we would continue to be impressing the wills of the people, just saying, you need to do this, or you need to do this better. And that's not what the gospel is teaching us. You know, when you think about the ideological spectrum, I'm brought back to the passage in Genesis 3, where Eve was really the first liberal and the first legalist, all at the same time. For me, it's not as though I have a tendency that leans this way all the time, or a tendency that leans this way. My heart vacillates between the two ideological extremes and ideological idols, depending on the circumstances and what is going to serve me well, right? So when it comes to dealing with my own sin, I'm very gracious and accommodating. God forgives me, and hey, God. And then when it comes to dealing with my spouse's issues, hey, you know what, honey, come on, you've got to change in this area. And I'm all about speaking the truth when it comes to my wife's issues, but when it comes to me, but you gotta, don't forget, do it in a spirit of gentleness, as Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, don't give me just the admonition, and we need to speak the truth in love, you see? I would say that we vacillate depending on whatever our self-interest might be. And so when we look in Genesis chapter 3, this is what Satan comes, and the serpent comes and is having a conversation with Eve, and Eve says this. She says, yeah, God told me not to eat from the fruit of that tree and not to touch it, and that's what she says initially. Now, God did tell Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit of that tree, but he didn't say anything about not touching it. So what she's doing is she's making God stricter than he actually is. He said don't eat it. He didn't say anything about not touching it. But again, I don't know within God's providential understanding, touching it might not have been a good thing either, because then you're kind of looking at it too much and being preoccupied with it when God told you not to eat of it and that sort of thing. I understand, but the text doesn't give us that. The command just simply says, don't eat the fruit of that tree. But she adds a little bit. And that's the tendency of the legalist, to add a little bit to what the Scripture has to say. Why? Why do you add? Why do people add? Why do we add? I mean, there are plenty of laws in the Bible. Not as many as we would think. That's why the Jewish commentators needed to get a commentary on the laws in the Old Testament. We don't have a whole lot of laws in the Old Testament. Even the so-called Torah, which is not the technical term for the Hebrew Scriptures, the technical term is Tanakh. Right? Torah is just the law, referring primarily to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But when you look at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it's primarily narrative. I mean, you find law, but it's primarily narrative. And so what do? They take the laws of the Old Testament, they write a voluminous commentary on it. It's called the Mishnah. There isn't a whole lot being said about the Sabbath, but in the Mishnah, there's an entire chapter called the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, Old Testament law. And if that were not enough, you have another commentary of the commentary of the Old Testament law. That's called the Talmud. And the Talmud is pretty fat too. And they had 2 different Talmuds. They had the Babylonian Talmud and then they had the Jerusalem Talmud, which are fat commentaries on the commentary, Mishnah, of the Old Testament law. Now, if that were not enough, then you've got the Aramaic Targumic tradition, which is a commentary on the commentary on the commentary of the Old Testament law. I mean, no wonder people feel the burden and the weight of the law. And so my question is, why would people want to do that? Why would you want to make God stricter, or why would you want to put more law on top of the existing law? It's because we want the law of God to be obeyable. We want God to be manageable. And if we can manage God, well, guess what? Then you can control what's happening in your life. You manage God, you manage the Holy Spirit, right? You manage how things happen in your life. And of course, that's very anti-biblical, but that's, again, the knee-jerk reaction. Let me ask you, what is easier to do? To give 1/10 of your herbs from your garden, if you have a garden, or to give sacrificially? I can go out to my little urban garden and pick out the basil leaves. Okay, I've got 100 here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and I have 10 basil leaves, and then I give that to a neighbor. Hey, God, I tithe my basil. You know, of course, that's much easier than to give sacrificially. So the reason why we are law-abiding, the reason why we have legalistic tendencies in this ideological spectrum is because we want God and the law of God to be obeyable and manageable. That is why Eve said, yeah, God said don't eat of that fruit, and he also told us not to touch it, making God stricter than he actually is. It's kind of like, so I live in a Victorian row house, so not a whole lot of space in the city. We've got 4 different levels, and my 2 older daughters, they live up on the top level, but our kitchen is on the bottom level. And so our youngest one, who loves eating, is always down there when we're cooking, and so the other 2 are upstairs doing whatever they're doing. And so I'll tell my youngest one, okay, I'll tell your sisters it's time to eat. And so what does she do? She leaves the kitchen, she looks up and says, dinner! You know, she screams up that way. Honey, if I wanted you to yell, I could have done that myself. And said, I want you to go up. Why does she do it? Because she doesn't want to go up the stairs. And she's kind of like begrudgingly kind of going up the stairs. And I hear her saying something to her sisters, and she comes back down. And 30 seconds later, I'm like, so where are your sisters? I don't know. I told them it's dinner. They're not coming down. I said, okay, I want you to go back up, and I want you to tell them, Daddy said it's dinner time. Okay, so you're going to be my representative and ambassador. You're going to go with my authority in my name, and I want you to go up there. She's kind of going up there like this, and I can overhear the conversation, and she says something like this. Daddy said it's dinner time. Come down right now. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. I said nothing about big trouble. But again, it's a tendency to make the loving father more strict than he actually is. Not only that, she goes on to say, yeah, he told us not to touch of it, otherwise we will die. No, that's not what God said. God said you will surely die. And she just said, oh, yeah, we'll just die.
So in other words, she's making God stricter, but she's now making God softer. In other words, God said that you will surely die. And in the Hebrew, there are two verbs to emphasize. In the Semitic languages, they repeat things for the sake of emphasis. They didn't have italicized and boldface and underline options. So what they will say is that you're not only going to die, but you're going to die. And then Eve says to the serpent, "Oh, we're just going to die." No, Eve, that's not what God said. God said, "You're going to die." And she said, "Oh, we're just going to die." So again, the tendency of the human heart is to kind of go this way, to abandon or privatize or to assimilate or under adapt. And that is what we need to be aware of as we're thinking about contextual issues. Now, what are the 5 questions that we need to ask for contextualizing the gospel in our community? The first is, what is your city's history or your town's history? And some of you are very, very good historians, but you might not have researched and figured out what the history is of your particular town. I think that would be very helpful. Second is, what are your city's values or your community's values? And you can figure that out by going to the local town hall meeting or going to a parent meeting or going to some open marketplace and looking at all the things that are being posted rather than being overly cynical and say, "Oh, look at this animal idolatrous worship." And I mean, I understand there is animal idolatrous worship in our communities, but be able to work through all of that and to see what are the things that they value. I mean, like, I can be a little cynical and say, yeah, in my city, man, they love their pets more than they love children. It's like they'll be going around with a pet. Everyone stops and says, "Oh, look at how cute the dog is," And there are these young moms who are kind of pushing a stroller around. No one even stops to see if she needs help or anything. There is a philosophy behind that, and we need to figure out what that is. Okay? And again, now, be careful that you don't do this. You're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to find the city's history. I'm going to find out what the city's values are, and I'm going to find out. I'm just going to pound away at that and to show how terrible our culture and our community is." Well, guess what? You'll never have any skeptics coming to the church. You see, I believe in the local church, as you do as well. I'm a Presbyterian. I have a high ecclesiology. So I believe that the conversion, the catechizing, the discipleship making, that happens in the local church. All the other stuff that happens, I'm not demonizing those things. They're wonderful, but they need to support the work of the local church. And so if we don't have skeptics coming to our church and hearing the gospel and being converted, where's that going to happen? And so we have to be careful, even as we challenge, that we don't demonize and we crush our skeptic neighbors. Because if they are there that one time, guess what? They'll never come back. They'll never come back. Third question is, what are your city's dreams? Let me take, just to show you how I would contextualize Silicon Valley and Las Vegas, right? Not a big fan of Las Vegas. I'm sorry if some of you grew up there, but I'd rather be in Silicon Valley. What happens in Silicon Valley never stays in Silicon Valley. Because they create, they innovate, they're making things, and the ideas and the technology and the innovation it gets shipped everywhere else. Whereas Las Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. In other words, Silicon Valley shapes the world through creating and exporting ideas and innovation, and Las Vegas shapes the world by being a pleasure destination, importing consumers. Now, if you don't understand the prevailing storyline of these two different cities, you're not going to know how to have a robust, contextualized ministry. You see how, those are two extreme cases, two very different cities. But you need to know that. You need to know that of Allen Park. You need to know that of Detroit. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with some of the other communities in the area. But fourthly, what are your city's fears? And of course, the fears will be the inverse of the dreams. So whatever you value, you also fear. If you don't have it, you're going to lose meaning in life. So Silicon Valley, for example, will be the status quo, or rest, or failure, or limited options, right? I mean, Silicon Valley, I can relate to them because they kind of think like uptight Eastern urban people, unlike a lot of the other California communities. So the fifth question is, what is your city's ethos? What is the city's ethos? And every church, every community has a certain kind of a cultural ethos. And you need to ask those sorts of questions. Now, the last thing that I want to do here, am I doing okay for time? The last thing I want to do here is to know how you will go about doing this, especially when you're communicating or catechizing your people and helping them to understand how to engage the culture. 3 steps to engaging your city story and engaging your culture. And this is nothing new. I just, if it sounds good, I've borrowed it probably. And it comes from Lamin Sanneh, who is a world-renowned theologian, social thinker out of Yale. Is a Gambian scholar from a small Western African country called Gambia next to Senegal. And he says it this way. He says, you need to enter, this will be a kind of simple summary of it, you need to enter into the other person's story, or the culture story, or your city's story, or your community story. You need to enter into that person's worldview, and then you need to challenge it, and then the third step is to retell that story in light of the gospel. Okay? I think that what we tend to do, again, from people from our theological camp, is we simply challenge it right from the beginning. I mean, I guess we could do that, but we see good examples even with Paul in Scripture, where he understands the prevailing cultural storyline of a particular city, and he uses that in order to nuance it, to bring the message of the gospel. It's very, very effective and very beautiful. Again, this is not accommodation. This is different than just being relevant. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find a point of reference. Os Guinness says that there are 4 important ingredients to good communication. Number 1 is identification. You need to find a point of reference. Number 2, translation. It needs to be translated in a language that is understandable. Thirdly, it needs to be done with persuasion. And fourthly, justification. You need to give them a reason for why they ought to believe whatever you're trying to tell them. And so identification, finding a point of reference, entering into that person's worldview. And secondly is to challenge it, and thirdly to retell the story. Let me give you a little bit of, give you some illustrations on this. The first one will be from 1 Corinthians. So Paul does this. I'm trying to show you. Acts 17 is not the only place to go, but there are other places where he does this in his own letters. In 1 Corinthians, he understood the issues with the Corinthians, the social issues and the idols. They had essentially compromised, and they were being drawn into all the things that they found in the Hellenistic culture. And what were those things in Corinth? You might be familiar with the city of Corinth. It was an ancient city, but it was ruined around 3rd century BC. And Julius Caesar came around the 2nd century, and then he completely reinvented the city, and it became a modern city at that particular time. At that time, it was a modern city. So there was no aristocratic class like some of the ancient cities. There was no elite aristocratic class, but everyone was just essentially going there because they saw the opportunity, and they would be able to, through the system of meritocracy, not aristocracy, to be able to make a name for themselves. And it was a very affluent city. So they were there, and they were essentially accommodating to the storyline of Corinth. And what was the storyline? Number 1, patronage. Patronage was huge. In other words, that they wanted to align themselves with a local patron, and they were the client. And so they wanted to be raised up with the reputation of the patron. Now, I understand patronage is an old word. We rarely use that word. The last time I saw that word was on a cover of a pizza box where it says, "Thank you for your patronage," right? Which is, it's really strange because the etymological development of that word has lost its real meaning. Because actually, we're not the patron. We're the client, right? But anyways, the point is that patronage is something that we find even in our modern culture. Why? Because if you have graduated from an elite institution, or you graduated from a very reputable seminary, or if you are from a particular theological network, and again, there's nothing wrong with taking pride, or even taking pride that you have been mentored by a very respected minister, or you're part of a great church. There's nothing wrong with that. But when there's an idolatrous, over desire for that, it ends up becoming your patron. So there's false modesty for the folks in our community. Probably about 30% of the folks in our church have graduated either from Harvard or MIT. So, they'll introduce themselves, and because they want to seem very, very humble, they'll say, "Oh, so where'd you go to school?" "Oh, I went to a school in Cambridge." Look, how many universities are there in the city of Cambridge? Unless you're thinking about the real Cambridge over in England, which is not a bad place to study either. But you've got MIT and you've got Harvard, right? So that becomes a patron for some of those people in a city where knowledge is their God. Okay? And so that's what they did, patronage. The second thing was the art of rhetoric. So it's kind of like the modern talk show host, right? Forever talking, saying nothing. In other words, they were very concerned about the stylistic kind of delivery, but not so much about the substance and the content. Paul was all about content. He wasn't too concerned about the delivery. But Apollos, on the other hand, was a trained speaker. That is why when there was factionalism within the church, they said things like, "Hey, I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. I follow Peter, Cephas. Oh, you know what? I'm sick and tired of all of you finding your own patrons, and I'm going to say I'm going to follow Christ." Well, you know what? Christ is not your patron. He's your Lord. And so you see how that's why you see this language from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 4 in this big literary unit with the emphasis on "I follow Paul, I follow Apollos." This is the reason why he keeps referring to this, because of patronage and the whole emphasis on the art of rhetoric. And thirdly was the upward social mobility that they wanted to advance, they wanted to develop. So what does he do? He uses language, vocabulary that would have caught their attention. Weakness. Oh, we don't like weakness. We like strength. Our leaders need to look very, very physically impressive. Oh, Paul, a wee little man. He's got physical ailments. Very not impressive. The cross? Oh, what's that? It's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's foolishness to the Greeks. Because in their prevailing cultural storyline worldview, it's all about strength. It's all about wisdom. It's all about power. And the cross says, well, it's upside down. You see what Paul is doing here? He is not rejecting the point of reference. He's using it to disarm their position. And that is a very, very powerful way to communicate. Enter into the prevailing cultural storyline. Find the point of reference. And there are many points of reference. Let me give a few here. I've been preaching through 1 Corinthians, and 2 weeks ago I preached on the issue of authority. And then this past Sunday I preached a sermon on 1 Corinthians 5 on discipline. And now, again, you know the cultural context of my city in Boston. Authority, church discipline. Yeah, they're not going to be too comfortable with that. Okay? So what do? I just say, hey, you know what? I could just directly say, yep, this is in the Bible, and I did say that's in the Bible, I'm here, and I'm not going to skip over it, and I need to be faithful, I need to preach through all of the even difficult parts of Scripture. But what I do is that I try to enter into their worldview, and I say, you know what? You have an aversion to authority and discipline. Why is that? And we start exploring that. And then I actually convince them in the process by saying, you know what, you actually do like authority. So it's not completely true that you don't like authority. And they'll be sitting there saying, what do you mean? I don't like authority. You're telling me I like authority. I say, yeah, you do. We like authority when we're wielding it, but we don't like it when someone is exercising authority on us. So we have no problems with intrinsic authority. We even use words like self-discipline. I don't mind engaging in self-discipline, but we don't like it when somebody's exercising discipline on us. There's some sort of external body or some external institution that's doing that. Oh, of course, I hate that because I'm a post individual and I want to deconstruct all totalizing discourses and institutions, and so I have an aversion towards authority. And I say, well, you don't say that to the academic institution where you studied, because they have very, very strict disciplinary rules when it comes to stealing intellectual property. So why is it that you don't have problems with discipline in that particular context, but you have problems with discipline in the context of the church? As a matter of fact, you don't even have problems with discipline within your own family context. Now, granted that there are many permissive parents. I'm sure there are less permissive parents here, but a lot of permissive parents in Boston where permissive parenting. You know, they just let the children do whatever they want. So I'll be in the playground and the kids are kind of playing in this, going down the slide and all that, and you'll see a young mother saying, "Hey, Johnny, don't do that." And then he just like talks right back. So, no, or saying this or whatever, and then she says, no, don't do that, and he's like throwing a temper tantrum, and then the mother starts like backtracking and starts apologizing. So, oh, okay, honey, just, I don't want you to get hurt. And I'm there watching this whole thing, and the kind of the Eastern part of me kind of kicks in, and I'm thinking, man, that kid needs a smack in the head. That's what he needs. Okay, make sure we edit that part in the video, But I'm thinking, that's disrespectful. You're supposed to respect your parents. You're not supposed to talk to your parents that way. That's permissive parenting. So if there is no discipline, if there are no authority structures within the home, you're going to raise tyrants and rebels as children when they become adults. So we're not actually loving them by being permissive. We're actually being unloving by not having discipline in the home. So again, what I'm trying to do is I enter in, I show them that discipline happens in different places. So why is it that you would have problems with discipline in the church? And here's this one. This was nice. I was actually very glad that I made this connection, and that was, I said, Apostle Paul makes it clear in chapter 5 of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, that he says that we are not to judge the outsiders about sexual immorality. We're supposed to judge those who are inside, those who profess to be brothers. Because people who are on the outside, of course, they don't believe the same core values. They don't have a biblical worldview, so they're going to do whatever they want. So we're supposed to be winsome and gracious and generous to those people who don't agree with you. But when it comes to those who are in the body, in the church, who consider themselves to be brothers, you need to keep them accountable. And so I spoke to the skeptics who are at our church. I said, I know you're saying, okay, here we go again, and the church is emphasizing authority and discipline and all that. And I'm saying, well, we're actually supporting your issues with the church. What would be one of the major complaints that you have? It would be hypocrisy. And I would describe a picture of somebody, okay, let's say some Christian pastor or leader of some mega church, high-profile person. All of a sudden, you find out through your Twitter feed that he committed some sort of sexual or financial misconduct. What happens at that very moment? Even as I'm describing this picture, what are you thinking? What's your knee-jerk reaction? You're thinking, oh, man, he's got to pay. Oh, wait a minute, I thought you didn't believe in discipline. I thought you didn't want accountability. Just let the pastor do whatever he wants. That's the worldview of tolerance. Why is it all of a sudden that you want to bring punishment or he's got to lose his job? And of course, you do that in a gracious way because you don't want to say, gotcha, and then they don't like that. They don't like it if you've gotten them in that moment. But you do that in a way, just try to help them to explain that, you see, you do have systems of accountability. You do recognize that appropriate and good and healthy forms of discipline are needed to maintain a very coherent universe. And so that is what we're trying to do. One other example. People say, oh, it must be hard to talk about the exclusivity of the Christian faith in a religiously pluralistic city such as Boston. I said, no, it's not. It's very easy to do. And so what I do is, we'll get to a passage such as Matthew chapter 7, where it says that the road that leads to life is narrow, and the road that leads to destruction is broad. And so what do I say? I say, well, yeah, I know many of you are saying Christianity is narrow-minded. This is one of the Christian defeaters, one of the criticisms that you have of Christianity. And I tell them that anything worth pursuing, anything that is valuable in life is narrow. And then I say for 35% of our folks who are in the healthcare industry, I tell them, you know what? Your pursuit, your aspirational pursuits for becoming a physician or a researcher or a postdoc, a scientist or a physician or a surgeon, it was very narrow. 4 years of pre-med. You were either organic chemistry or biology. You took the MCATs. You got into medical school. 4 years of medical school. After that, you got an MD, but you're not a real doctor. I don't want you touching me because you don't know anything after coming out of medical school. So what has to happen? You have to go do an internship and 3 years of residency at a hospital. And after that, if you want to be a specialist, then you need to do 1 or 2 years of fellowship. And after having paid $300,000 worth of debt load, you're now a real doctor at the age of like 50. That pursuit was very, very narrow. So should we come to you as a physician or a surgeon? I have a Mohs dermatology surgeon. There are only 7 of him in the state of Massachusetts. So he makes a lot of money. And so there's 7 of those. Are we supposed to go to him and say, hey, Dennis, it's very narrow. You're very narrow-minded for being the kind of Mohs cancer dermatology surgeon that you are. Of course we wouldn't do that. Then why is it that we bring that sort of thinking when it comes to understanding Christianity? It's the same thing with athletics, same thing. If you want to be an Olympic athlete, you're going to have to be narrow. So again, you find a point of reference, you enter into their worldview, and then you show them the weaknesses of their position, and then you deconstruct their presuppositions, and then you retell the story with a beautiful story, the more beautiful story of the gospel.